In this video, you're going to make your very first Node.js web server, which means you'll have a whole new way for users to access your app. Instead of having them run it from the terminal, passing in arguments, you're going to be able to give them a URL they can visit to view your web app, or a URL they can make an HTTP request to fetch some data. This is going to be similar to what we did when we used the Geocode API. Instead of using an API, though, we'll be able to create our own. We'll also be able to set up a static website for something like a portfolio site, both really valid use cases. Now, all of this is going to get done using a library called Express, which is the most popular NPM library. It's actually one of the reasons that Node got so popular, because it was so easy to make REST APIs and static web servers. Express is a no-nonsense library. Now, there are a lot of different ways to configure it, so it can get pretty complex. That's why we're going to be using it throughout the next couple sections. To get started, let's make a directory where we can store all of the code for this app. This app is going to be our web server. On the desktop, I'm going to make a directory called Node Web Server by running mkdir node-web-server. Once this directory is created, I can navigate into it using cd, and I can also open it up over inside of Atom. In Atom, I'm going to open it up right on the desktop. Now, before we do anything else, I want to run npm init so we can generate that package.json file. Right here, I'm going to run npm init. And I am going to use the default value just by pressing enter through all of the options. There's no need to customize any of these for the moment. Then I can type yes, and there we go. The package.json file is now in place. As I mentioned, Express is a really big library, and they actually have an entire website dedicated to their docs. Instead of a simple readme.md file, you can go to expressjs.com to view everything they have to offer. They have getting started help articles, they have guides on how to do things like routing, debugging, and error handling, and they have an API reference, so you can look into exactly what methods you have access to and what they do. It's a really handy website. It's important you know it's here, so down the line, you can always refer to it to explore things that we won't get to in this course. Next up, we're going to go ahead and install Express so we can get started making our web server. Over in the terminal, I'm going to run clear first to clear the output. Then I'll run npm install. The module name is Express, and we're going to be using the latest version at 4.14.0. I'm also going to provide that save flag to update the dependencies inside of our package.json file. Once again, I'm going to use clear to clear the terminal output. Now that we have Express installed, we can actually create our web server over inside of Atom. In order to run the server, we are going to need a file. I'm going to call this file server.js. It's going to sit right in the root of our application. This is where we'll configure the various routes, things like the root of the website, pages like /about, and so on. It's also where we'll start the server, binding it to a port on our machine. Now, we'll be deploying to a real server later. We'll talk about how that works. For now, most of our server examples are going to happen on our local host. Inside of server.js, the first thing I want to do is load in Express by making a constant called Express and setting it equal to require Express. Next up, what we're going to do is make a new Express app. To do this, we'll make a variable called app, and we'll set it equal to the return result from calling Express as a function. Now, there is no arguments we need to pass into Express. We will be doing a ton of configuration, but that's going to happen in a different way. We'll explore that down below. In order to create an app, all we have to do is call the method. Down below, we can start setting up all of our HTTP route handlers. For example, if someone visits the root of the website, we're going to want to send something back. Maybe it's some JSON data, maybe it's an HTML page. We can register a handler using app.get. This is going to let us set up a handler for an HTTP GET request. There's two arguments we have to pass into GET. The first one is going to be the URL. In our case, we're looking for the root of the app, so we can just use /. And the second argument, this is going to be the function to run, the function that tells Express what to send back to the person who made the request. I'm going to use a simple arrow function. Excellent. Now, this function is going to get called with two arguments. These are really important to how Express works. The first one is request, and the second one is response. Request stores a ton of information about the request coming in. Things like the headers that were used, any body information, the method that was made with the request, the path, all of that is stored in here. The second argument, response, has a bunch of methods available to you, so you can respond to the HTTP request in whatever way you like. You can customize what data you send back, you could set your HTTP status codes, you can do all sorts of things. I promise we'll be exploring both of these in detail. For now, though, what we're going to do is use one method, response.send. This is going to let us respond to the request sending some data back. Right in here, let's go ahead and call response.send, passing in a string. In here, I'm going to type hello express. This is the response for the HTTP request. So when someone views the website, they're going to see this string. If they make a request from an application, they're going to get this back as the body data. Now, at this point, we're not quite done. We have one of our routes set up, but the app is never going to actually start listening. What we need to do is call app.listen. App.listen is going to bind the application to a port on our machine. In this case, for our localhost app, I'm going to use port 3000, a really common port for developing locally. Later on, we'll talk about how to customize this depending on whatever server you use to deploy your app to production. For now, though, a number like 3000 works. With this in place, we are now done. We have our very first Express server, and we can actually run things from the terminal and view it in the browser. Inside of the terminal, I'm going to use nodemon to start up our app. Nodemon server.js. And this is going to start up the app. And as you're going to see, the app never really finishes. Right now, it's hanging. It's waiting for requests to start coming in. The apps that use app.listen, they're never going to stop. You're going to have to shut them down manually with Control-C like we've done before. It might crash if you have an error in your code, but it'll never stop normally since we have that binding set up here. It's going to listen to requests until you tell it to stop. Now that the server is up, we can go ahead and move into the browser and open up a new tab visiting the website. Localhost, followed by the port 3000. This is going to load up the root of the website, and we specified a handler for that route. Right here, Hello Express shows up, which is exactly what we expected. Now, there's no thrills, there's no formatting, nothing too fancy. We're just sending a string from the server back to the client that made the request. What I'd like to do from here is open up the developer tools so we can explore exactly what happened when that request was made. Inside of Chrome, you can get to the developer tools using settings, more tools, developer tools, or you can use the keyboard shortcut shown here for your operating system. I would highly recommend memorizing that keyboard shortcut because you'll be using the developer tools a ton in your career with Node. I'm going to open up the developer tools, which should look similar to the ones we used when we ran the Node Inspector debugger. They're a little different, but the idea is the same. We have a bunch of tabs up top, and then we have our tab-specific information down below. In our case, I want to go to the network tab, and currently we have nothing, so I'm going to go ahead and refresh the page with the tab open, and what we see right here is our localhost request. This is the request that's responsible for showing Hello Express to the screen. We can actually go ahead and click the request to view its details. This is something we'll be doing extensively throughout the course. I know this page can be a little overwhelming at first. There is a heck of a lot of information. Up top, we have some general info, like the URL that was requested, the method that the client wanted. In this case, we made a GET request, and the status code that came back. The default status code being 200, meaning that everything went great. What I'd like to point your attention to is one response header. Right here, under response headers, we have a header called content type. This header tells the client what type of data came back. Now, this could be something like an HTML website, it could be some text, it could be some JSON data, and the client could be a web browser, an iPhone, or an Android device, or any other computer with network capabilities. In our case, we're telling the browser that what came back, it's some HTML. So why don't you go ahead and render it as such? We used the text/HTML content type. And this automatically got set by Express, which is one of the reasons it's so popular. It handles a lot of that mundane stuff for you. Now that we have a very basic example, I want to go ahead and step things up a notch. Inside of Atom, we can actually provide some HTML right inside of send by wrapping our Hello Express message in an H1 tag. Now later in this section, we're going to be setting up a static website that has HTML files that get served up, and we'll also look at templating to create dynamic web pages. But for now, we can actually just pass in some HTML to response.send. I'm going to save the server file, which should restart things over in the browser. And when I give it a refresh, we get Hello Express printing to the screen. This time though, we have it in an H1 tag, which means it's formatted by the default browser styles. And in this case, it looks nice and big. With this in place, we can now open up the request inside of the network tab, and what we get is the exact same thing we had before. We're still telling the browser that it's HTML, only this time we actually have an HTML tag, so it gets rendered using the browser's default styles. The last thing I want to look at before I give you a challenge is how we can send some JSON data back. Sending JSON is really easy with Express. To illustrate how we can do it, I'm going to comment out our current call to response.send and add a new one. I'm going to call response.send, passing in an object. On this object, we can provide whatever we like. I can go ahead and create a name property, setting it equal to the string version of my first name. I can make a property called likes, setting it equal to an array. And on here, I can specify some things I like. Go ahead and add a few things that you like. I'm going to add biking as one of them, and I'll add cities as another. When we call response.send, passing in an object, Express notices that. It takes it, it converts it into JSON, and it sends it back to the browser. When I save server.js and NodeMon refreshes, I can refresh the browser, and what I get is my data formatted using JSON view, which means I can collapse my properties and quickly navigate the JSON data. Now, the only reason JSON view picked up on this is because that content type header that we explored in our last request, it actually changed. If I open up localhost, a lot of things look the same, but now content type has an application /JSON content type. This content type tells the requester, whether it's an Android phone, an iOS device, or the browser, that JSON data is coming back, and it should parse it as such. That's exactly what the browser does here. Express also makes it really easy to set up other routes aside from the root route. We can explore that over inside of Atom by calling app.get a second time. Right here, I'm going to call app.get. I'm going to create a second route. We'll call this one about. Then I'm going to provide the handler. Notice here I just used /about as the route. It's important to keep that / in place, but after that you can type whatever you like. In this case, we're going to have a /about page that someone can visit. The handler is going to take the request and the response object. This is going to let us figure out what kind of request came in, and it's going to let us respond to that request. For now, just to illustrate, we can create more pages. We'll keep the response simple. Response.send. Inside of the string, I'm going to go ahead and print about page. Now when I save the server.js file, the server is going to restart, and over in the browser, we can visit /about. At /about, we should now see our new data, and that's exactly what we get back. About page shows up. Using app.get, we're able to specify as many routes as we like. For now, we just have an about route and a / route, which is referred to as the root route. The root route returns some data. This data happens to be JSON, and the about route returns a little bit of HTML. Now that we have this in place and we have a very basic understanding about how we can set up routes in Express, I'd like you to go ahead and create a new route as the challenge. I'm going to leave a few comments down below to guide you along the way. What I'd like you to do is create a route at /bad. This is going to simulate what happens when a request fails. It's not going to do anything crazy for the moment. All you're going to do is respond using response.send. You're going to send back some JSON data, send back JSON with an error message property. The error message property can get set to whatever you like. You could go ahead and use something like unable to fulfill this request or error handling request. Then I'd like you to go into the browser, navigate to /bad, and make sure the JSON data shows up. Take a moment to pause the video, knock that out, and when you're done, click play. How'd you do? Hopefully, you were able to make that new route and visit it in the browser, seeing the JSON data you sent back. Right here, I'm going to call app.get. This is going to let us register another handler for a GET HTTP request. In our case, the route we're looking for inside of quotes is going to be /bad. when someone makes a request for this page, what we want to do is going to be specified in the callback. The callback is going to take our two arguments, request and response. I'm going to use an arrow function, which I've used for all of the handlers so far. Inside of here, the challenge was to send back some JSON. We're going to do that by calling response.send, but instead of passing in a string or some string HTML, we're going to pass in an object. Now that we have our object in place, we can specify the properties we want to send back. In this case, I told you just to set one error message and to set an error message to whatever you like. I'm going to go ahead and set my error message property equal to a string, unable to handle request. Perfect. Next up, I wanted you to save the file, restarting it in NodeMon and visit it in the browser, making sure your error message showed up correctly. In the browser, I'm going to visit /bad, hit enter, and what do we get? We get our JSON showing up using JSON view. Right here, we have our error message and we have the message showing up, unable to handle request. Now, if you are using JSON View and you want to view the raw JSON data, you can actually click View Source, and it's going to show you right here in a new tab. Here, we're looking at the raw JSON data where everything is wrapped in those double quotes. I'm going to go ahead and stick to the JSON View data, though, because it's a lot easier to navigate and view. With this in place, we are now done the challenge and we're also done the video. We now have a very basic Express application up and running. It listens on port 3000 and it currently has handlers for 3 URLs. When we get the root of the page, when we get /about, and when we make a GET request for /bad. In the next video, we're going to look at how we can set up a static web server. So when you have an entire directory of JavaScript, images, CSS, and HTML, you can serve that up easily without needing to provide routes for everything. So stay tuned. I will see you next time. I am super excited to keep moving on.